Thank you, John. It's great to be with you today and with the other good folks at Heritage, Jennifer Marshall, Senator Jim DeMint. Appreciate y'all's hospitality very much today. We will be talking about Prodigal Press, confronting the anti-Christian bias of the American news media. As John said, Dr. Marvin Olasky wrote this book originally 25 years ago, and it's been widely used in college classrooms around the country, but much has happened in the past 25 years. The 24/7 news cycle that John referred to is, of course, facilitated at least in part by the internet. When the original book, Prodigal Press, was written and published in 1988, the internet, I'm fond of saying, was merely a gleam in Al Gore's eye at that time. But since then, of course, the internet is really driving what happens in the news cycle. So we felt like it was due for an update. We started working on this book about 3 years ago, and it was just published in September. We've been delighted by the reception of the book so far. And what I'm going to do today is to just share with you some of the ideas that are in this book. I want to talk a little bit about World News Group, just to kind of give you an idea of who we are, even though John did a great job of setting me up on that score. And also, I want to be really clear that my purpose today is not to bash the mainstream media. I do not in any way, shape, or form consider the mainstream media or the what some people call the legacy media as the enemy. I do believe, however, that we are in the midst of a sort of a pathological media culture, and that some of the ideas that I'm going to share with you today, I hope, will allow us to identify some of those pathologies, and then ultimately perhaps even to find a way out of that pathology and provide a hope for the future, as you can see here. First, a few words, if you'll allow me, a point of personal privilege about World News Group. We're the largest Christian news organization in the country. We have World Magazine, which has about 400,000 readers. We come out 26 times a year. We also have a robust presence on the internet, about 500,000 to 600,000 unique visitors a month to our website, over 2 million page views. Beginning about 2 years ago, we also started a radio program called The World and Everything in It. It's a 2-hour weekend program and a 30-minute daily program. For those of you who are used to listening to things on Christian radio, you will discover that it is not anything like what is on Christian radio. It sounds much more like National Public Radio than it does anything that you would normally hear on Christian radio. Nick Eicher and Joseph Slife are the two co-hosts of that program, and they've been doing an excellent job with it. Starting after the first of the year, we're going to start a new 30-minute interview program that I will host. And once again, it's not really patterned after anything on Christian radio, but think Charlie Rose or Fresh Air with Terry Gross, and you'll have a little bit more of an idea of what we're trying to create with our radio presence. We also have a World on Campus website, which is targeted towards young people, and a whole range of age-specific children's publications that are widely used in the Christian school and the homeschool community. Well, I'd like to begin by just sharing what for many of you will be obvious, and that is that mass media is dominant in our culture today, and it has a profound impact on the way we think. The average young person will spend about 54,000 hours with some form of mass media before they reach their 17th birthday. Now, compare and contrast that to the amount of time that the average young person might spend in church. Even if you go to church every day, 52 weeks, or every Sunday, 52 weeks a year, for your entire growing up time, you will spend less than 1,000 hours in church. So now that doesn't necessarily mean that one is having less or more of an impact than the other. That's just a matter of how much time you spend with them. Some of the time we spend with mass media is passive. But I think that these numbers really sort of put into sharp relief at least the amount of time that we spend with these various influences on the way we think. And I think would probably be a little bit disingenuous to claim that massive amount of time has no impact on us whatsoever. In fact, Senator Joseph Lieberman, who many of you know was no doctrinaire conservative, he was a Democrat and then later an independent senator, said this: more than 3 decades of research has firmly established that electronic media have a powerful influence on the attitudes, values, and behavior of America's children. This influence has grown only larger as the amount of time that young people spend consuming media has grown greater. I don't think any of us would argue with that, and that's one of the ideas that we begin to explore in Prodigal Press, is how the content of the media shape the way we think. We also look at how the media themselves shape the way we think. But let's take a look at content first. I'd like to begin often my presentations about the content in the news media and how much it has changed over the years by saying I want to share with you the story of a great Christian newspaper. That newspaper is the New York Times. Now, if you read the New York Times today, you don't think of it as a Christian newspaper, but in fact, it was founded by Henry Raymond, a Bible-believing Presbyterian Christian in the 1850s. In the 1870s, one of his star investigative reporters, a man named Augustus St. Clair, went undercover in the abortion facilities of New York. Some of you today may have heard of folks like Lila Rose or James O'Keefe, who has gone undercover with video cameras into Planned Parenthood and other facilities and posted these videos on the internet. And that has been touted as an innovative use of social media and modern technologies to do investigative reporting. But in fact, that was being done by the New York Times in the 1870s. The Times passionately opposed abortion in its both editorial pages and news coverage, calling it infant murder and saying the practice is rank and smells to heaven. In fact, one abortionist that was exposed by the New York Times actually ended up spending 7 years in prison as a result of those stories. And the New York Times was not alone. Between 1825 and 1845, as Marvin Olasky documented in the original version of this book, Prodigal Press, over 100 cities and towns across America had explicitly Christian newspapers, including the Boston Recorder, edited by a man named Nathaniel Willis, one of the most interesting and lively publications of its era. During that same period, New York City alone boasted 52 magazines and newspapers that called themselves explicitly Christian. But of course, we know that the New York Times is Christian no more. The Times today regularly editorializes in favor of same-sex marriage and abortion, two ideas that most evangelical Christians find abhorrent. Recent Times columnist Thomas Friedman equated the Tea Party with Hezbollah, and fellow Times columnist Joe Nocera did him one better, saying that the Tea Party Republicans have waged jihad on the American people. Now, whether you agree or disagree with Thomas Friedman and Joe Nocera, I think that you would have to agree that calling Tea Party Republicans jihadist reflects a certain tone deafness when it comes to theological distinctives. So we begin to, see that that religious coverage, use of religious language in newspapers, in anything that resembles a knowing usage, has dramatically deteriorated, not just in the New York Times, but in other publications as well. So much so that to the point where Jill Abramson, who became the first female editor of the Times in 2011, said this: "In my house, the Times substituted for religion. It was the absolute truth." So, again, we see how far the New York Times has come within a 150-year period, and I think it's fair to say that that's what's happened at the Times is fairly indicative is what has happened in many other publications. Well, to highlight all of the reasons for this change would cause us probably to be here for days, and besides, I'm here to talk about the book, and we have documented much of this in the book, but I would simply say that there's been a lot of cultural, technological, and political changes that have taken place over those 150 years. In other words, there wasn't a switch that went on or off that caused the mainstream media to go from a fundamentally religious worldview to one that is fundamentally irreligious, or at least not religious today. But it's been a wide variety of events and changes in our culture that have occurred during that period of time. Some specific events that we talk about in some detail in Prodigal Press are the rise of transcendentalism. Most of us remember from our high school English courses. Maybe we've tried to forget over the years, but we might remember, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Nathaniel Hawthorne and other of the transcendentalist writers. What we might forget about those folks is that they were also men